For centuries, historians have glossed over this story, but what really happened was far darker. Picture Spain in the early 19th century, a kingdom teetering between old-world grandeur and the tremors of modern revolution. And at its center stands Ferdinand VII, a king whose personal insecurities would prove as lethal as any invading army. Behind the gilded halls of the royal palace, secrets festered, obsessions grew, and paranoia became law. By the end of this video, you'll know the full story behind Spain's most dangerous king. The secrets, tragedies, and shocking truths history textbooks won't tell you. Imagine being born into immense power, yet never feeling secure. Ferdinand VII entered the world in 1784 as the son of Charles IV and Maria Louisa of Parma, two monarchs whose own insecurities and indulgences created a volatile court environment. From the beginning, Ferdinand's life was tightly choreographed, every smile measured, every gesture scrutinized, every potential weakness noted. Even as a child, he carried the weight of expectation and the fear that he would never measure up. Court life was both a gilded cage and a battlefield. Nobles whispered behind fans, rivals schemed for influence, and the king's counselors were adept at playing on Ferdinand's anxieties. Some historians suggest that Ferdinand's extreme physical condition, later described in private medical accounts as an unusual anatomical abnormality, compounded his insecurities, fostering a deep sense of shame. Unlike the confident, imposing monarchs of legend, Ferdinand was often hesitant, unsure, and painfully aware of how the world might judge him. Even his marriages became sources of torment. Ferdinand's first union, arranged for political advantage rather than affection, was fraught with humiliation. His wife, Maria Antonia of Naples, reportedly struggled with both the public demands of royal life and Ferdinand's peculiar sensitivities. Their relationship, marked by tension and secrecy, offered no solace. If anything, it intensified Ferdinand's obsession with control and perception. Every whisper of gossip in the corridors of the palace was magnified in his mind, every glance at him or his spouse interpreted as judgment. It was in these early years that the seeds of his later ruthlessness were sown. You can almost feel the walls of the palace closing in, the tapestries heavy with whispers, the chandeliers glittering like the eyes of invisible critics. Ferdinand learned, quickly and painfully, that power alone could not shield him from humiliation. In his mind, suspicion became instinct, and distrust a survival tool. By the time he ascended to the throne, Ferdinand's psychological landscape was already treacherous. His reign began in 1808, in a Spain racked by external threats and internal instability. Napoleon's ambitions loomed over Europe, and Spain was a kingdom divided, politically, socially, and morally. Ferdinand's father had already vacillated under pressure from French and British influences, leaving the young king with a precarious foundation. But Ferdinand's greatest battles were not on foreign fields. They were within his own court. Every advisor could be a traitor, every noble a potential conspirator, every ally a possible enemy. He developed a reputation for extreme suspicion, personally overseeing investigations into alleged disloyalty, often resulting in imprisonment or exile without trial. Stories of secret chambers and hidden dungeons circulated, where courtiers disappeared and rumors of torture lingered like shadows. One night, a well-documented incident reveals the depths of his paranoia. Ferdinand had become convinced that a minor noble, known for his eloquence and charm, was plotting to undermine the throne. Guards were dispatched in silence. The noble was confronted alone in a candlelit hallway. Ferdinand's voice, trembling with rage and fear, demanded loyalty. When reassurances were given, they rang hollow to him. By morning, the noble had vanished from court records, erased in a manner that whispered of terror more than justice. For Ferdinand, every interaction became a test of loyalty, and every failure, real or imagined, demanded punishment. Perhaps the most disturbing chapters of Ferdinand's life lie in the intersection of medicine, secrecy, and obsession. Privately, Ferdinand subjected himself to a series of bizarre treatments and medical examinations, often conducted under strict secrecy. The aim, according to surviving accounts, was both to understand and to correct his unusual physiology. Some historians speculate that these interventions were deeply humiliating, yet Ferdinand insisted on them, fueling a cycle of shame and obsession. Imagine the scene: a royal physician, dimly lit chambers, intricate instruments designed to probe, measure, and manipulate, all while the king sat, anxious and isolated, desperate to reconcile his own self-image with the image the court expected of him. These medical experiments were not merely scientific inquiries. They were psychological crucibles, exacerbating Ferdinand's insecurities and shaping his worldview. In his mind, the physical and the political were inseparable. Any weakness, internal or external, must be identified and neutralized. This obsession bled into public policy. Laws became tools of control, courts a mechanism for surveillance, and the palace itself a stage for relentless assertion of authority. Those who served Ferdinand had to navigate not just political loyalty, but the unpredictable, psychological terrain of a monarch who saw danger in every shadow. Ferdinand's personal neuroses became national crises. After returning from exile during the Napoleonic invasions, he ruthlessly reasserted his claim to the throne. Liberal reforms, popular during his absence, were violently suppressed. Supporters of constitutional monarchy faced imprisonment, exile, or execution. Historians describe the period as one of intense political repression, where fear and suspicion became instruments of governance. Courtiers learned quickly: to survive was to anticipate every nuance of Ferdinand's temper. A careless word, a lingering glance, or even a private thought revealed in jest could seal a noble's fate. Public ceremonies became displays of absolute submission, while behind the throne, invisible tensions mounted. Rumors of secret trials and unseen punishments spread, ensuring obedience through terror. Yet Ferdinand's cruelty was not merely tactical. It was personal. He internalized every insult, every perceived slight, and transformed it into a justification for draconian measures. In a paradox that continues to fascinate scholars, his deepest vulnerabilities, shame, insecurity, obsession with bodily and personal control, became the very engine of his tyranny. By the time Ferdinand's reign ended, Spain was a nation scarred by the collision of personal insecurity and absolute power. Economically strained, politically fractured, and culturally anxious, the country bore the imprint of a king whose inner turmoil was inseparable from his public actions. Yet even in death, Ferdinand's story is a warning. The personal is political, and the hidden recesses of a ruler's mind can shape the destinies of millions. Imagine walking through Madrid today, past the same streets Ferdinand once patrolled, the same palaces echoing with steps long silenced. You might glimpse the shadows of a man whose life was both a cautionary tale and a mirror, a reflection of how power, fear, and obsession can intertwine to devastate both ruler and realm. History is more than dates and battles. It is a mirror of our darkest obsessions and greatest resilience. Ferdinand's personal life was as treacherous as the political landscape he navigated. His second marriage, to Maria Isabel of Braganza, promised an alliance that might stabilize the monarchy. Yet, as with most of his personal relationships, it soon became a theater of anxiety and obsession. Ferdinand's insecurities manifested in relentless scrutiny, suspicion of infidelity, and compulsive control over the Queen's movements and interactions. Every letter she received, every visitor she entertained, became potential proof of betrayal. One particular account from the royal archives illustrates this vividly. Ferdinand demanded that all of Maria Isabel's correspondences be read aloud before him, a ritual he justified as protection for the monarchy, but which isolated her completely. Court whisperers noted that the queen appeared increasingly withdrawn, fearful of her husband's volatile temper. The tragedy of this union lies not merely in personal misery, but in how it mirrored the governance of a nation. Every perceived slight, every imagined threat, met with disproportionate response. Meanwhile, the palace itself teemed with intrigue. Advisors, courtiers, and servants maneuvered carefully, knowing that misstep could lead to disgrace, exile, or worse. Spies were not just employed for national security. They were tools of domestic surveillance, ensuring that even the private lives of the nobility conformed to Ferdinand's obsessive standards. The line between fear of rebellion and fear of embarrassment blurred, creating a culture of paranoia that infected every corner of the court. No account of Ferdinand VII would be complete without the looming specter of Napoleon Bonaparte. In 1808, as the Napoleonic forces advanced into Spain, Ferdinand was manipulated, coerced, and eventually imprisoned in France. From his cell, he witnessed the collapse of royal authority, the abdication of his father, and the rise of Joseph Bonaparte, Napoleon's brother, as Spain's puppet monarch. Ferdinand's time in captivity revealed another facet of his personality, his profound sense of injustice and his obsession with reclaiming control. Letters written during these years are suffused with bitterness and resentment. Every interaction, even with French guards, became a battleground of dominance and submission. Yet there was also calculation. Ferdinand realized that his eventual return would demand ruthless consolidation of power, a lesson he would apply with merciless efficiency. When Ferdinand finally returned to Madrid in 1814, the landscape had shifted dramatically. Liberal constitutional movements had begun to take root, inspired by Enlightenment ideals and resistance to French occupation. Ferdinand, however, saw these movements as existential threats, extensions of the same chaos that had temporarily displaced him. What followed was a relentless crackdown on reform, a reversal of progressive policies, and the imposition of absolute monarchy under the banner of restoring order. Ferdinand's methods of control were as subtle as they were brutal. Publicly, he projected the image of a king dedicated to tradition and divine right. Privately, he orchestrated purges, secret trials, and covert punishment. Historians describe how entire networks of intellectuals, reformers, and suspected conspirators were systematically silenced. Writers were censored, newspapers shut down, and educators replaced with loyalists trained to instill obedience. The chilling aspect of Ferdinand's tyranny lies not in spectacle, but in its intimacy. Fear infiltrated every social layer. Families whispered warnings to children about offending the king. Courtiers learned to navigate invisible rules. A glance could be interpreted as defiance, a delayed blow as rebellion. Through this intricate web of intimidation, Ferdinand maintained authority, not merely by law, but by turning his personal insecurities into instruments of national governance. Even military strategy bore the mark of his obsession. Ferdinand distrusted generals who might gain popularity or question royal directives. Promotions were less about merit and more about loyalty, creating an army that reflected the king's own paranoia. Disciplined outwardly, fractured inwardly, always teetering on the edge of mutiny. The more power Ferdinand acquired, the deeper his insecurities seemed to grow. Behind the pomp of coronations and official decrees was a man haunted by self-doubt and bodily anxieties. Court physicians documented his compulsive routines, his obsession with private examinations, and his sometimes extreme reliance on medical counsel for reassurance. It's tempting to imagine these habits as quirks, minor eccentricities of a monarch. Yet they were manifestations of a deeper psychological struggle, a king attempting to reconcile his physical and emotional vulnerabilities with the absolute authority he wielded over millions. Every act of cruelty, every decree of suppression, can be read as a reflection of this inner turbulence, a defense mechanism externalized into policy and practice. In one particularly revealing anecdote, Ferdinand reportedly instructed architects to redesign parts of the royal palace to accommodate secret chambers where he could retreat, observe, or escape perceived threats. The palace became a labyrinth, as much psychological as architectural, mirroring the convoluted networks of suspicion and control he wove throughout Spanish society. By the time of his death in 1833, Ferdinand VII had left behind a Spain deeply scarred by his reign. The nation faced economic stagnation, political instability, and social tension that would ignite decades of conflict. But beyond material consequences, Ferdinand's story illustrates a darker truth. The interplay of personal insecurity and unchecked power can distort the course of history. Walk through the streets of old Madrid, and you might still sense traces of his shadow. The royal palaces, the narrow alleys, the libraries filled with banned books. Each tells a story of a king whose inner turmoil rippled outward, touching every corner of the kingdom. Ferdinand VII's life forces us to confront uncomfortable questions. How much of a ruler's personal psychology shapes the destiny of a nation? Can obsession, fear, and shame, when dressed in the authority of kingship, become instruments of historical change? Even today, scholars debate the nature of Ferdinand's pathology, the morality of his decisions, and the balance between personal suffering and public cruelty. But the consensus is clear. His reign was a stark example of how private insecurity can metastasize into national oppression. And in understanding his life, we gain more than historical insight. We glimpse the fragile lines separating human vulnerability from historical catastrophe. History, after all, is not only written in battles and treaties. It is etched in the lives of those who wield power, in their obsessions, fears, and choices. Ferdinand VII reminds us that the most dangerous threats are sometimes the ones that arise from within. The collision of ambition and insecurity, fear and authority, body and mind. By mid-reign, Ferdinand's grasp on power was near total, yet the very absoluteness of his authority intensified his fears. Imagine a king sitting alone in the dim glow of candlelight, the corridors of the palace silent, except for the distant echoes of footfalls. Each sound, each shadow, could signify betrayal. The paradox of Ferdinand's rule was that the more control he exerted outwardly, the more fragile he felt inwardly. This fragility manifested in erratic decision-making, swings between cruelty and indulgence, and sudden purges of trusted advisors. Ministers who had served loyally for years could be dismissed or imprisoned without warning. Some historians argue that Ferdinand's unpredictability became a strategic weapon. Fear became a method of governance, keeping both nobles and commoners alike perpetually off balance. Yet it also destabilized the administration, making Spain a kingdom perpetually on edge. Ferdinand's obsession with control extended beyond politics. The king reportedly micromanaged even the minutiae of court etiquette, the precise angles of bows, the correct phrasing of formal letters, the timing of every entrance and exit. For those serving him, life was a constant test. A misstep could be interpreted as rebellion, ignorance, or personal affront. In effect, the court became a psychological minefield, one in which loyalty was never enough. Ferdinand's insecurities did not stop at the walls of the palace. He extended them to the very soul of Spain, targeting cultural and intellectual movements that threatened his vision of absolute monarchy. Writers, philosophers, and educators who championed liberal ideas faced censorship, imprisonment, or exile. Libraries were purged, newspapers shuttered, and public discourse tightly controlled. One vivid account describes the suppression of a literary society in Madrid. Its members, inspired by Enlightenment ideals, had been quietly discussing reforms to Spain's legal and educational systems. Ferdinand's secret police learned of their meetings and intervened with swift, brutal efficiency. The participants were arrested in the dead of night, some never to be seen again, their homes ransacked, manuscripts burned. In Ferdinand's eyes, intellectual curiosity was a threat because it might empower others to challenge him, a reflection of the paranoia that had haunted him since childhood. Even art was subjected to his scrutiny. Painters and sculptors were expected to glorify the monarchy while avoiding subjects that could hint at dissent or moral critique. Ferdinand's court became a place where creativity was tolerated only if it reinforced his narrative, a chilling example of how personal insecurity can shape an entire culture. Despite his power, Ferdinand was profoundly alone. His obsession with control and suspicion of others created emotional isolation. Friends were scarce, confidence rarer still. Even family members were potential threats in his eyes, as loyalty could never outweigh the perceived risk of betrayal. To cope, Ferdinand turned inward, relying on rituals, medical interventions, and private retreats. Diaries and letters from contemporaries describe long hours spent in solitary reflection, often punctuated by fits of anger or despair. It's possible to imagine him pacing the corridors of the palace late at night, his thoughts consumed by fears of inadequacy, plots against him, or the fragility of his own body. The trappings of kingship could not shield him from the inner turmoil that had haunted him since birth. In this isolation, Ferdinand's obsessions became magnified. Secret experiments, physical examinations, and obsessive monitoring of his court took on the force of necessity. To him, every precaution was rational, every act of cruelty an act of survival. Yet this self-protective logic only deepened the terror and repression experienced by those around him. Spain's political landscape during Ferdinand's reign was turbulent, and the king's personal insecurities shaped his response to every crisis. The independence movements in Latin America, sparked by both Enlightenment ideals and opportunistic rebellion, were met with a mix of paranoia and violent retaliation. Ferdinand, convinced that loyalty could not be assumed, dispatched military forces, sometimes overreacting, sometimes withdrawing in sudden fear of betrayal. Internal uprisings were handled with equal intensity. Popular protests, often driven by hunger or political frustration, were crushed decisively. Observers note that Ferdinand's responses were not always strategic but deeply personal, a reflection of a ruler whose fear of disorder was inseparable from fear of personal humiliation. Spain became a country living under tension. Citizens obeyed not merely out of loyalty, but from the omnipresent shadow of the king's suspicion. Even in diplomacy, Ferdinand's temperament had consequences. Ambassadors found him volatile, easily offended, and prone to overreaction. Treaties were renegotiated under duress, alliances strained by sudden decrees, and European powers learned that Spain's unpredictability mirrored the psychological instability of its monarch. The personal and the political were inseparable, and every decision bore the stamp of Ferdinand's insecurities. The toll of Ferdinand VII's reign extended beyond politics and court intrigue. It touched every corner of Spanish society. Ordinary citizens experienced economic strain, social unrest, and moral policing. Nobles lived in fear of sudden disgrace. Clergy navigated shifting alliances, and intellectuals faced censorship or exile. The psychological weight of living under such a monarch was immense, creating a society marked by suspicion, silence, and self-censorship. Contemporary accounts describe a climate where fear was normalized. Loyalty became performative, and survival demanded constant vigilance. Ferdinand's inner turmoil had manifested as a national condition, paranoia institutionalized, insecurity codified, and personal obsession transformed into a tool of governance. Yet there is a tragic, almost human element to this story. Ferdinand's cruelty, while devastating, was inseparable from his suffering. A man haunted by shame, by fear, and by bodily anxieties, he wielded power not merely to dominate, but to defend himself from the very shadows he imagined lurking in every corner of his kingdom. As Ferdinand approached the end of his life, the weight of both personal insecurity and political responsibility took its toll. Reports suggest he became increasingly withdrawn, dependent on loyal advisors for even minor decisions, and obsessed with the succession. The question of who would inherit the throne was both a political and deeply personal concern, a reflection of the intense anxiety that had governed his life from birth. His death in 1833 closed a chapter of Spanish history marked by terror, obsession, and the unrelenting collision of personal weakness with absolute authority. What remained was a kingdom altered by one man's insecurities, a society still grappling with the effects of fear and repression, and a historical example of how intimately human frailty can shape the fate of nations. History, as Ferdinand VII's life demonstrates, is not just a record of events. It is the story of human psychology writ large, of vulnerabilities and obsessions given power over millions. His reign reminds us that rulers are not abstract figures of authority. They are human beings, flawed, haunted, and sometimes catastrophically so. History is more than dates and battles. It is a mirror of our darkest obsessions and greatest resilience. Even in death, Ferdinand VII's life continues to provoke reflection on the paradox of absolute authority paired with profound insecurity. Consider the contrast: a king with virtually unchecked power over millions, yet a man haunted by bodily anxieties, personal shame, and an obsession with loyalty. The crown did not protect him from fear. It magnified it. His story challenges the assumption that power and confidence naturally coexist. Instead, it demonstrates how authority can amplify vulnerability. This paradox shaped his decisions at every level. Every decree, punishment, or purge was not merely political maneuvering, but an extension of his internal struggle. When faced with dissent, Ferdinand did not consult advisors for counsel alone. He sought reassurance against imagined slights. Every act of cruelty was both defensive and performative, a way to assert control over the chaos he feared, both within himself and across the nation. For ordinary Spaniards, Ferdinand's insecurities translated into tangible oppression. Taxes were often raised abruptly to fund military campaigns against perceived threats, while social reforms were rolled back in favor of reinforcing traditional hierarchies. Education was stifled, books were censored, intellectuals punished. The subtle tyranny of daily life, the fear of misstep, the necessity of constant vigilance became ingrained in society. Imagine walking through the streets of 1820s Madrid. Merchants whispering about taxes and conscriptions, students carefully choosing their words, families avoiding political discussions lest a child inadvertently attract attention. Spain became a country where obedience was not voluntary but compelled by an omnipresent psychological pressure. And at the top of this hierarchy, the king himself lived under his own oppressive shadow, trapped by fear while simultaneously generating it in others. Ferdinand VII's reign is a stark illustration of a broader principle. Personal psychology matters. Historians often examine wars, treaties, and revolutions, but the inner life of rulers can have equal or greater impact on the course of events. Ferdinand's insecurities, sexual, physical, and emotional, directly shaped the machinery of the Spanish state. They dictated policy, informed punishments, and determined alliances. The personal became political, and the private obsessions of one man affected millions. One chilling example lies in the king's reaction to liberal movements. Where a confident, secure monarch might have negotiated compromise, Ferdinand responded with suppression. The result was not only political stagnation, but a reinforcement of fear across the nation. His insecurities created cycles of paranoia and repression that persisted long after his death, influencing Spanish society for decades. For years, Ferdinand VII was dismissed in historical accounts as merely cruel or inept. But modern scholarship suggests a more nuanced and darker interpretation. He was not a monarch who ruled out of laziness or ignorance. He ruled through fear because fear mirrored the terror he felt within. Every secret experiment, Every surveillance measure, every violent decree was motivated by the same anxiety, the belief that the world was conspiring against him and that he alone must maintain order. It is tempting to read his reign purely as a cautionary tale of cruelty, yet there is also tragedy here. Ferdinand was a man attempting to reconcile immense power with profound personal vulnerability, and the tension between these forces created consequences far beyond the palace walls. Understanding him requires empathy as well as horror, a recognition of how private struggle can shape public catastrophe. Ferdinand's unusual physical condition, described in private accounts as extreme and socially awkward, cannot be overlooked when examining his reign. Though historians rarely dwell on it, it profoundly influenced his self-perception and behavior. Public appearances were a source of anxiety, intimacy a source of shame. He compensated for these vulnerabilities through strict control over every aspect of life around him, from the palace to the kingdom itself. Imagine the psychological toll. A king aware that every gaze, every whisper, might expose a weakness, yet responsible for an entire nation. The desire to dominate, monitor, and punish emerges less as malice and more as a desperate strategy for survival. His physical insecurities fused with political paranoia, creating a governance style both unique and devastating. When Ferdinand VII died, Spain did not simply inherit a monarchy. It inherited a culture shaped by decades of repression and paranoia. Fear, censorship, and suspicion were embedded in institutions, and trust was eroded across society. His reign offers a haunting lesson. When the ruler's inner turmoil drives the machinery of state, the consequences ripple far beyond individual lives, leaving lasting scars on national identity. Even today, historians debate the degree to which Ferdinand's personal pathologies shaped Spain's trajectory. Could the liberal movements of the 19th century have flourished under a different ruler? How might the nation have evolved if fear, rather than personal insecurity, had been the driving force of the monarchy? These questions linger, offering insight not just into history, but into human nature itself. Ferdinand VII's story resonates beyond Spain and beyond the 19th century. It reminds us that rulers are human, that inner fears can have outer consequences, and that absolute authority without self-awareness can destabilize societies. His life is a lens through which we can examine the broader dynamics of power, psychology, and governance. Consider modern parallels. Leaders whose personal insecurities drive policy, corporate figures whose paranoia shapes organizational culture, or any environment where fear governs decision-making. Ferdinand's reign illustrates the extreme endpoint of this phenomenon, a historical case study in how private anxieties can metastasize into public suffering. In the shadows of his palace, in the dungeons of his political machinery, in the silenced voices of intellectuals and commoners alike, Ferdinand VII left a chilling testament to the power of insecurity. Yet there is also human complexity here, a man whose fears were immense, whose vulnerabilities were deep, and whose actions, though devastating, were inseparable from his humanity. History is more than dates and battles. It is a mirror of our darkest obsessions and greatest resilience. Even centuries later, Ferdinand VII casts a long shadow over Spanish history. Museums, palaces, and historical texts all preserve fragments of his reign, yet the true essence of his life is more elusive. It is found not in dates or treaties, but in the trembling anxiety behind decisions, the silent terror of courtiers, and the quiet despair of a king trapped by his own mind. His story forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth. History is not just the sum of battles and policies, but the reflection of human frailty writ large. Imagine walking through the halls of Madrid's royal palaces, silent now, where once whispers of intrigue and fear echoed endlessly. The walls still seemed to hold secrets, the hidden chambers Ferdinand had built, the surveillance routes for courtiers, the spaces where medical experiments and obsessive examinations took place. Each room, each shadow, carries the imprint of a man whose inner torment dictated the fate of an entire nation. Ferdinand VII's reign also compels us to examine the human face behind tyranny. He was not merely a figure of cruelty. He was a man burdened by shame, obsession, and relentless insecurity. His decisions, though often devastating, were inseparable from the psychological pressures that had shaped him since childhood. The story of Ferdinand VII reminds us that leaders are not abstractions. They are flawed, fragile humans whose personal demons can reverberate across history. This duality of vulnerability and cruelty is what makes Ferdinand's story so haunting. On one hand, he represents the dangers of absolute authority, unchecked by empathy or self-awareness. On the other, he's a tragic figure, imprisoned not by walls or chains, but by fear, shame, and the relentless burden of his own body and mind. Understanding him requires both moral judgment and compassion, a recognition that history's villains are often shaped by forces as intimate and uncontrollable as their own psychology. Ferdinand's influence extended far beyond his lifetime. The oppressive measures, fear-driven governance, and culture of paranoia he cultivated left deep scars on Spanish society. Subsequent rulers had to contend not only with the political and economic consequences of his reign, but with the psychological residue that persisted among the people and the elite. Intellectual movements were delayed, liberal reforms were hindered, and social trust was eroded, all a legacy of one man's insecurities projected onto an entire nation. Yet there is also a cautionary lesson in his life for those who study history today. Personal psychology matters. The inner life of leaders can shape the fate of nations, and unchecked insecurity at the highest level can metastasize into systemic oppression. In Ferdinand VII, we see the extreme endpoint of this principle, a ruler whose private fears became public catastrophe. As we reflect on Ferdinand VII's life, it becomes clear that history is more than a sequence of events. It is a study of human behavior in extremis. His story is a lens through which we can examine the interaction between power and vulnerability, authority and insecurity. He reminds us that the machinery of state is ultimately guided by human hands, hearts, and minds, each susceptible to the same fears, obsessions, and frailties that shape everyday lives. The Spanish people endured the consequences of his paranoia and cruelty, yet his reign also serves as a broader lesson. Absolute power without self-awareness is perilous, and personal insecurities can have historical consequences far beyond the private realm. Even as historians analyze treaties, revolts, and wars, the hidden human element remains a crucial factor, shaping decisions in ways that textbooks rarely capture. In the final analysis, Ferdinand VII's life and reign illuminate the darkest intersections of personal insecurity and political authority. He was a king who wielded immense power yet lived in constant fear, whose obsessions dictated national policy, and whose cruelty was inseparable from vulnerability. His legacy is not only political, but deeply psychological, offering an enduring testament to the consequences of power left unchecked by self-knowledge and empathy. Walk through the streets of modern Madrid, past the same royal palaces and historic squares, and it is possible to sense the echo of his reign, a reminder that history is not just written in stone and parchment, but in the choices, fears, and obsessions of those who shape it. Ferdinand VII's story is haunting, tragic, and instructive. It tells us that the most dangerous monarchs are not necessarily those with malicious intent alone, but those whose personal insecurities have been amplified into instruments of national consequence. History is more than dates and battles. It is a mirror of our darkest obsessions and greatest resilience. In Ferdinand VII, we see a reflection of the fragility, obsession, and human complexity that can turn power into a force both awe-inspiring and terrifying.